Know your enemy, and you can fight 100 battles without fearing defeat. The Chinese general and military strategist Sun Tzu stated very clearly in The Art of War that being successful at warfare is all about knowing your enemy. 2,000 years later, the same saying is still true. And it does not only apply to military strategy, but it also applies to cyber defense, and in particular, to DDoS defense. DDoS defense has become this eternal cat-and-mouse game in which attackers try to outplay existing solutions, existing defenses, and network operators try to predict what will be the next attacker's move. And in this cat-and-mouse game, the probability of a network operator in successfully mitigating a DDoS attack is largely determined by how much he or she knows the attacker's abilities, tools, and techniques. So that's why in this talk, I'd like to introduce to you the latest type of DDoS attack that we've seen in the wild, and which rendering existing defenses ineffective. And I'd like to give you some ideas on how you can mitigate them. I'm talking about none other than pulse wave DDoS attacks. Pulse wave DDoS attacks are a new type of network layer DDoS attacks. Network layer DDoS attacks target a critical link in the network infrastructure. So the attacker's objective is to generate a high amount of traffic towards that critical link with the objective of not getting the victim traffic to get through, congesting the link and not getting the victim traffic to get through. As such, network layer DDoS attacks are volumetric. They can reach hundreds of gigabits per second, and they can leverage multiple attack vectors, like, for instance, NTP, DNS, or Memcached. Different from conventional network layer DDoS attacks, pulse wave DDoS attacks are composed by a series of short-duration, high-rate traffic pulses. We can see that with an example. This is an attack that was reported by Google in 2021. You can see in green the benign traffic and in red the attack traffic. And as you can see, attack traffic is composed by this series of very short duration, high rate traffic pulses that in this case have a duration of approximately 1 minute. So what makes these attacks so threatening? Well, what makes them very critical is that they target the limitations of existing DDoS defenses. What are these limitations? Well, we have 4 limitations. The first one is that existing DDoS defenses only cover a narrow set of attack vectors. If you take a look at signature-based defenses or at access control list, you can see how they only cover a small set of attack vectors. Pulse wave DDoS attacks exploit this limitation by leveraging multiple attack vectors in the different pulses so that they maximizes the chances to succeed. Second, existing DDoS defenses rely on drastic mitigation techniques, such as, for instance, routing or filtering, directly dropping potentially malicious traffic. This drastic mitigation can have negative implications in case of misclassification. Third, existing DDoS defenses have slow reaction time. The reason is that they are usually composed by hybrid architectures in which we have an in-network defense responsible for detecting the attack, and an external facility that is the one responsible for deciding how to mitigate those attacks. So the time that it takes for the in-network defense to reach the external facility until the external facility manages to mitigate the attack can take in the order of seconds or up to minutes. Pulse wave DDoS defense exploit this limitation by sending this succession of attack pulses, such that by the time that the defense has managed to mitigate one of the pulses, another pulse kicks in, making the whole mitigation process to be restarted all over again. And finally, existing DDoS defenses also have the risk of misconfiguration. And the reason is that they usually rely on threshold-based activation mechanisms, and configuring these thresholds is very hard. So if you configure a too big threshold, you may be missing attack traffic. And if you configure a too small threshold, you may be detecting benign traffic potentially as attack, having false positives. So if we were to build a pulse wave DDoS defense today, we would like it to be generic, so that it can cover a broad range of attack vectors. We would like it to be safe, so that we don't have this risk of impacting performance of benign traffic in case of misclassification. We would like it to be fast, so that we can detect each and every one of the pulses of pulse wave DDoS attacks. And we would like it to be fully automated, so that we don't have the risk of misconfiguration. So that's why, in this work that we're presenting today, we asked ourselves whether it's actually possible to build such a pulse wave DDoS defense. And the answer is yes, and that's why we're presenting ACC-Turbo. ACC-Turbo is a pulse wave DDoS defense that relies on programmable switches to mitigate pulse wave DDoS attacks while being generic, safe, fast, and fully automated. But in order to fully understand ACC-Turbo, we need to take a step back 20 years ago when the original ACC was proposed. ACC was proposed as a conventional network layer DDoS defense that manages to control the bandwidth of high bandwidth traffic aggregates in the network and manages to be generic and safe, so already satisfying 2 out of the 4 design requirements. So the high-level idea is to identify those traffic aggregates that are responsible for a high amount of congestion in the network and to control the throughput of these aggregates so that they cannot impact the performance of other aggregates in the network. It does so by relying on 2 key techniques, packet clustering and rate limiting. ACC runs on top of a random early detection queue. So intuitively, this random early detection queue drops packets probabilistically depending on the average size of the queue. So when the queue is empty, no packet is dropped. When the queue is full, all the packets are dropped. And in between, packets are dropped probabilistically depending on the average size of the queue. Once a packet is dropped, it's reported to an ACC agent that can run in either a control plane or a separate server that will try to cluster all these dropped packets with the idea that aggregates responsible for a high amount of drops will be also aggregates responsible for congestion in the network. So once an aggregate is inferred, ACC then synthesizes a rate limiting policy and deploys that rate limiting policy into the data plane such that incoming packets of the same aggregates can be rate limited before making it into the queue. So as such, by leveraging packet clustering and working at the aggregate level, ACC manages to be generic. And by leveraging rate limiting, it manages to be safe. However, ACC is not fast because it relies on this ACC agent that runs on a controller or an external facility, and it's not automated because it relies on a threshold-based activation mechanism. So how can we make ACC fast and fully automated? To make it fast, we have to offload the inference process directly to the data plane. However, as you can imagine, this is hard because we have very constrained hardware today to work with. So today, programmable switches, they can only process packets just once. We have limited state, and we have limited access to this state. And if that was not enough, we also have limited computation, as some of you already know. So how can we offload this clustering process directly in the data plane, given the hardware constraints that we have? Well, the answer is using online clustering. Online clustering is a clustering algorithm, or better, a clustering framework that assumes an endless stream of data points such that the algorithm needs to cluster each data point at the data point arrival and cannot perform any more action on that data point once it has already processed it once. So if we translate this framework into our setup, packet forwarding, what we have is a continuous stream of packets such that for every packet that arrives into the switch, we need to decide whether we want to cluster it either to an existing cluster or we want to merge 2 existing clusters and create a new cluster for the new packet. So with this framework, we still have 3 different design decisions. How do we represent packets in the feature space? How do we represent clusters in the feature space? And which distance metric do we use to compute the closest cluster to the packet? So we represent packets by using header space representation, in which the space is defined by the different dimensions, in which each dimension is one of the header fields of the packet. And the packet is just a data point that is defined by the values of the header fields. We represent clusters as regions in this header space, and we store clusters by using only ranges or sets of values that packets inside the clusters have, which we store using registers or Bloom filters in data planes. And we use a very simple distance metric, which is the Manhattan distance, which requires very little amount of memory because the output space is small, and it does not require any complex computation, so we can also implement it in programmable data planes. So with that, we have online inference, and we allow ACC to be fast. What about automated? What do we do with these clusters? Well, this is challenging because of 3 reasons. Once we have these clusters, we have to find a way to identify whether they are malicious or not. We have to find a way to mitigate potentially malicious clusters, and we need to decide when to mitigate those clusters. And we've said at the beginning that we can have false positives, like, for instance, flash crowds look very similar to attack traffic. We don't want to mitigate them using drastic defenses like rerouting or filtering, because we can have these false positives. And we don't want to rely on threshold-based activation mechanisms, because then we have the risk of misconfiguration. So how do we do it? Well, the answer is that we do it by using programmable packet scheduling. Programmable packet scheduling allows us to deprioritize malicious clusters. So how do we do it? First, we extract cluster statistics, such as the cluster size and the rate of the packets that match into the cluster. And we use these statistics to try to infer the probability that that cluster contains attack traffic. Clusters containing attack traffic intuitively will be narrow and will have high rates. So once we have this probability of whether a cluster contains attack traffic, we synthesize a priority, a scheduling priority, such that we deprioritize those clusters that have higher chances of being malicious. Leveraging programmable scheduling is beneficial because it allows us to leverage the whole uncertainty spectrum. So instead of just identifying traffic as either malicious or not, so a binary decision, and directly dropping what seems malicious, what we're doing is just synthesizing this probability, and from that probability, deriving the priority and leveraging the whole information that we have, the fine-grained priority, instead of just doing a binary decision of black or white. Second, using programmable scheduling is also safe. It only drops packets under congestion, and it's transparent otherwise. And it will always start by dropping those packets that look more malicious. And since it's transparent, we can leave it constantly running, which allows us to anticipate the reaction, anticipate the mitigation, and speed up the reaction time. So that's how ACC-Turbo works in one slide. Whenever packets come into the switch, we cluster those packets directly into the data plane. We analyze the statistics of the clusters and prioritize the packets of the clusters depending on how malicious they look. With this design, we managed to go from ACC, which satisfies 2 of the design requirements, to ACC-Turbo, which manages to satisfy the 4 design requirements. We evaluated ACC-Turbo by using hardware-based evaluation and software-based evaluation, using Tofino for the hardware and NetBench for packet-level simulations. We compared with state-of-the-art. We evaluated on a wide number of pulse-wave DDoS attacks. We analyzed the performance of new versions of ACC-Turbo that are still not implementable in hardware, but we expect to be implementable in the near future. And we also analyzed the impact of the different design decisions. But I would like to just show you the most important results, in my opinion, which is reaction time. So this is a plot of a UDP flood attack, very simple one. You can see in green the benign traffic, and you can see in red the attack traffic. And under no defense, as you can see, as soon as the attack kicks in, the benign traffic gets completely deprioritized. Well, completely, the attack traffic manages to get all the bandwidth. Instead, when we use ACC-Turbo, we can see how we rapidly mitigate the attack traffic, and we manage to deprioritize attack traffic, and benign traffic manages to recover all the throughput. And I just would like you to, I would like to share with you just 2 quick observations. The first one is that since we deprioritize attack traffic and not just drop it, if the attack traffic turned out to be a false positive, we will not be just dropping that, for instance, flash crowd, minimizing the impact on benign traffic in case of misclassification. And the second and most important observation is that we managed to identify and mitigate the attack traffic in less than 1 second, which is 10 times faster than the state-of-the-art. And that's reaction time. That under-second reaction time is exactly what allows us to not only cover traditional network layer DDoS attacks, but be also able to mitigate pulse-wave DDoS attacks. And that brings me to the end of my talk, in which we've seen pulse-wave DDoS attacks, which manage to render existing defenses ineffective by exploiting their limitations. And we've seen how ACC-Turbo manages to mitigate pulse-wave DDoS attacks at line rate by leveraging programmable switches. And it does so by leveraging online clustering and programmable packet scheduling.
Thank you. Thank you for an excellent talk. Questions? Let me ask a quick one. So I think you're assuming that all the attack traffic is somewhat centralized. I mean, if it's coming from, say, 100 different locations, so no location would know, enough to do the clustering. How would this work in that situation?
Exactly. So here, it's fundamental to decide which features do we use for the clustering. And in our paper, you will see how we evaluate in even complex scenarios in which you can use randomization elements, like, for instance, source spoofing, or even carpet bombing scenarios in which you target all the subnet instead of just a single defense. It's clear how the more randomization we add into the features that we use for the clustering, the harder it is for us to identify the attacks. However, by picking the features smartly and by adding some elements to reduce this randomness or picking the features that give us more information, we are able to actually mitigate a broad range of attacks, even in the case of source spoofing or carpet bombing.
Okay.
Hi. I was wondering if you have considered, in addition to mitigating the attack, to monitor the packets so that if you get packets with lower priority, you can still receive this information, for example, in the control plane and analyze the attack itself.
We have not considered, actually. So what you're saying is whether we've considered to mirror, let's say, the attack traffic to a control plane so that we can analyze it later, or a sample of it. We have not considered it, but it's something that we could do. It's important also to realize, though, that by deprioritizing, since we are not filtering, this traffic will still, or a portion of this traffic, the one that doesn't get starvated, will still make it into the destination. So we are not just directly discarding it, we are sending it, and that's the reason why ACC-Turbo is safe, because in case it turns out to be not an attack, but benign traffic that is misclassified, we are not directly dropping it.
Question? Over here.
Hi, nice talk. Actually, I have a simple question about the reaction time. How did you measure the reaction time in your case? Did you enable one, like a timer in the switch?
I will just come to the side here around for.
How do we measure the reaction time?
Yes, exactly. That's my question.
So we generate attacks that we can measure when do we start the attacks, and then we measure the time that it takes for the benign traffic to recover the throughput. However, it's a bit more complex than that. Well, for ACC-Turbo, it's just that. But for the state of the art, we do a bit more complex evaluation, because, as I said, existing defenses, they rely on an external facility that has to sometimes deploy a mitigation before it can be mitigated. So in this time, we do fundamental analysis of what is the minimum time that it takes for a switch to swap between one defense or another to another. Or we measure the time that it takes for a control plane to read the most simple defense, for example, a very simple heavy hitter, and deploy a filter rule so that we can have the minimum reaction time. And even measuring the minimum reaction time for the existing defenses and measuring the experimental reaction time for our defense, we show that we're still at least 10 times faster than the state of the art.
Thanks.
Question? Over here?
Yep.
Yeah, it was a great talk. Thanks very much. I'm wondering whether there's the chance that regular traffic might develop a pulse wave form and therefore be detected as a DDoS attack for not based in any maliciousness, but for instance, bottleneck link bandwidth patterns and that sort of thing.
Completely, and that's actually the reason why we need a defense that is safe and that does not directly drop all the traffic once it's identified as potentially malicious, since it can be a false positive, as you mentioned. Actually, we have a whole section explaining how to evade or what can happen under misclassification in the paper. And actually, the intuition here is that even if we have such an event, if we only have benign traffic in the link, the benign traffic will not get all the throughput. So the most that it can happen is that it just gets a bit deprioritized with respect to other benign traffic, which is not as aggressive as an actual DDoS attack. The worst case scenario will be having an actual DDoS attack and having some benign traffic that looks somehow more malicious than the actual DDoS, and therefore you will be deprioritizing benign after the actual attack, which will take all the bandwidth. However, as we study in the paper, even though on paper looks easy, in practice it's not that easy to have such an event, and we argue why it's hard to have this type of events in which benign traffic looks more malicious than a potential attack while simultaneously they're taking place.
Okay, so thank you very much. Let's thank the speaker.
Thank you.